Welcome to Chatting with Ingram. This is episode 14. I'm Philip Ingram, and today I'm talking again to Hugo Rosemont, the Director of Security and Resilience with ADS. And we're talking during this difficult time of lockdown through the COVID-19 pandemic. Warning, you might actually learn something. Hugo, great to see you.
Great to see you again, Philip.
Now, ADS, you put on, before the pandemic hit us, security and policing at Farnborough, which was a huge success. I really enjoyed being there. How did it come across from your perspective?
Well, Philip, thanks for the feedback. Yes, we were very pleased with the event. This took place between 3rd and 5th of March down in Farnborough in the United Kingdom, just south of London. And obviously, an event taking place at that particular moment in time was not the most straightforward planning environment, shall we say, but we were delighted with the turnout and the fact that we received the same number of visitors and actually a slightly enhanced number of exhibitors was really good opportunity for the UK security and resilience sector for the industry to promote its capability to domestic and international stakeholders. And I'm happy to say that many of our international allies and partners attended, notwithstanding the challenging environment. So we were very pleased. The feedback's good. And we kick on for March 2021.
Now, you had some fantastic features at the show. Can you tell those that are watching a little bit about the features? And it's probably too early at the moment, but what are you planning for next year's?
Well, thanks. The event introduced a number of new features, really the cornerstone of which was a brand new feature that we were very proud of called the Fusion Forum. This was a new sort of interactive theatre that we put in the main exhibition hall. It was really designed to have a really deep and detailed conversation between government and industry on managing national security challenges. So it's deliberately designed as a sort of an open thought leadership exchange where before the event, we actually set a number of national security challenges to the exhibitors in attendance. 3 topic areas where we asked specific questions. Questions which we formed with government partners were around how to mitigate the use of hostile drones around small sites around the country, so sort of beyond the major installations such as Gatwick Airport and Heathrow. How do we actually achieve that at small sites? We then had one on the protection of crowded places and specifically how to actually roll out training across the whole of the open space environment in the UK. That's quite a substantial challenge there. And then lastly, not least, we had a challenge on CBRN, so mitigating the impact of chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear attack, and specifically a question focused on remediation. And I'm happy to say that around that particular feature, which had a whole host of other content, including keynotes and other panel sessions, we had a real genuine exchange between policymakers in the UK security machinery and industry who brought their ideas to the fore on how to actually mitigate those challenges. So feedback for that was tremendous, and we're certainly planning to repeat it next year.
And within that, complementing it, there were a number of amazing immersive demonstrators that were there. They provided a real additional capability into the event that I think a lot of people enjoyed.
Absolutely. So this event is the official UK Home Office annual event, which we're, as ADS, very sort of privileged to have their trust really to actually deliver that. And they were really responsible for driving 2 live immersive features at the event. One was on finding new ways to tackle knife crime, and it involved a number of sort of companies, but also charitable foundations to participate in finding new ideas and innovation to actually tackle the blight of an unfortunate rise in violent crime in the UK, not just in the UK, but certainly in some of our major cities. And then the second one was a live immersive feature called Plan, Travel and Visit. And this was really the end-to-end solution of planning and then delivering a fully integrated transportation solution with fully integrated security solutions from scanning technology all the way through to the use of data to mitigate risks, including terrorism, but organised crime and a whole host of other issues. Obviously, now we're in a very challenging period around the use of the airport network, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to be thinking about delivering integrated solutions in the transport network moving forward. And I think S&P Security and Policing 2020 offered a great platform to show the sort of solutions that we can be using in 2, 5, 10 years' time.
Well, yes, very interesting times. I don't think and I was there and at it, I don't think anyone thought of a pandemic as a way of stopping knife crime on the streets of London. It's certainly influencing and having an impact on the security industry. What are you seeing from the trade body's perspective, the effects the pandemic's having on the industry?
Well, thanks for the question. And ADS represents sort of four sectors, really: aerospace, defence, security and space. We have about 1,200 member companies. And one of the decisions we took quite early into the process, if that's even the right expression for this current situation, was around ensuring that we were very accessible and available to our members. And to do that, we took a decision that we'd be phoning each and every one of the members across the organisation to check in, see how they're doing, an annual callback initiative, as we call it internally. So like many of my colleagues, participated in that, and really the impacts vary depending on sort of the nature of the business. You know, we have companies who are manufacturing solutions across all those four sectors who are literally having to introduce social distancing mechanisms on the manufacturing floor. You know, the idea of us implementing these sort of measures just, I guess, 8 weeks ago was almost inconceivable. So fair to say that business operations have had to shift quite a lot in that period. We have seen a lot of our members, over 10 of them, in fact, large, medium and small companies, directly involved in supporting the government's ventilator challenge here in the United Kingdom. We have a well-documented need, or had, to actually manufacture urgently a good number of new ventilator capabilities to help mitigate this crisis, help support the National Health Service with what it needed. So we've also seen a manufacturing pivot, as I sometimes call it, which is, you know, our members who perhaps are more used to manufacturing sort of commercial aircraft, pivoting quite quickly to actually play a role in support of the government's national effort to deliver a response. So a hugely rapidly evolving environment. It's not easy out there, I must say, but it's good to see our members making such good contributions, notwithstanding this challenging climate.
Yes, I think the last time we saw such a massive change from the sorts of industries that are your membership was probably the Second World War.
It's quite interesting because on the security and resilience side, Philip, we're very conscious that the last major sort of event that had such serious security implications was around the London 2012 Olympics. That in itself was the largest sort of military deployment on mainland Britain since the Second World War. This far exceeds, obviously, the London Olympics in terms of the resources that the state is bringing to bear, the whole resources of the government machinery. And I think it's fair to say in that context that whilst industry played a major role in the London Olympics, the response to this particular crisis is calling on even more from our industry. So yeah, I would agree that it's a whole national effort here. Happily, our members are playing a really constructive period. I'm not going to sit here and say that a good number of SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, aren't finding it very difficult at the moment. In some cases, that is obviously the case, but I think when the government is asked, and it's good to ask, it has found a good response. And I think we need that sort of spirit of openness between government and industry so that we can help mitigate this extremely challenging time, as well as the challenges that no doubt will come in front of us in the future.
And where can people go, the people that are watching this, go to get more information about ADS and the support that ADS is giving your members out through this difficult period of time?
Well, thanks for that. And we have obviously our website, that's www.adsgroup.org.uk. And I think I'd recommend to any viewers, particularly ADS members, but it is an open source of information, our COVID-19 hub that we have accessible by the homepage. And in there, there's everything from drawing on and signposting government guidance that we have. And obviously the UK government, like many governments, is implementing a wide range of sort of financial measures and support to the industry. So clearly signposted for members there. But one of the things I would like to draw attention, and perhaps more widely, is that on that web page, there's also an area which lists current live calls for support from our members in terms of the capabilities. So whether it's supporting things like the ventilator challenge, whether it's the urgent call now underway for manufacturers and others to help support the urgent manufacture of PPE, personal protective equipment and clothing, whether it's finding new solutions and new ideas and innovation that the state hasn't even thought about. Just over the past 24 hours, we've had contact from the government around how it is that the drone suppliers industry might be able to support this crisis. And so it's through the ADS website that we put these opportunities, some of which are funded, some of which are calls for information. And it's a really important direct route through to the industry.
We talked a little bit about the security side of what ADS is going on earlier, but your other hat very much is on the resilience side. I'm slightly surprised when I hear people saying this is unprecedented and we didn't know it was happening and all the rest of it. Yes, it is unprecedented, but it's been the number one threat at the top of all government resilience planning, all local resilience forum planning for at least the last 10 years, an influenza-type pandemic. Is it, from what you've seen, that industry hasn't picked up on that? Have they acted like ostriches and just stuck their head in the sand because it's been all too difficult? Is it fair that there's a lot of criticism in the system when actually it had been planned for, it had been exercised, but people just didn't seem to be, or the impression is people just didn't seem to be listening?
I think the context is, as you say, really important to look at in the first instance. Since the government, the UK government, introduced its national
risk register process and then subsequently a national security risk assessment to underpin development of a national security strategy and a much more integrated approach across government, with the creation in 2010 of a National Security Council and associated machinery, a National Security Advisor. And if we look at that in that context, we see that whilst, of course, there's been a lot of jointery across government historically, I think there's an even greater push since 2010 on really reforming the machinery and taking a whole system approach to this. And you're quite right to say that, particularly following the early 2000s, when there was a number of national crises which really exploited and, if not exploited, sort of showed up the lack of preparedness and structure that we had around this. I'm thinking things like the foot and mouth crisis, the petrol crisis, as it were, and a whole host of flooding through that decade. And a recognition by the then Labour government under the leadership of Tony Blair that, we do not have an appropriately configured central national security and resilience coordinating mechanism. So a lot of work was done to build that up. And a lot of work was done, as you say, to make the assessment. So I wholeheartedly agree that, as it were, that the assessment of the risks that you make was well documented by both government and industry. Now, I think it is fair to say, and as many people are saying now, there will be lots of time when the inevitable inquiry comes to actually sort of pour over some of this in terms of how we were sort of configured. And we're still in the midst of this crisis, of course. But what I would say is, I think in terms of the interaction between the public and private sectors across these areas of national security and resilience, and therefore, helping to generate the sort of preparedness that we're talking about here. I think there has been a much deeper conversation, obviously, with the private sector in the round on counterterrorism. That includes, to a certain extent, resilience aspects. Resilience is about hopefully preventing, but if not preparing for, responding to and recovering from. And there's been a good dialogue on the recovery from terrorist incidents with the public and the private sectors, and we've seen that in action. We've also seen that increasingly in areas like cybersecurity, even to a certain extent on organised crime. But where are the structures and mechanisms for that sort of dialogue with the private sector on, for example, a medical health emergency? I think therein lies a bit of the rub when we see we probably don't have the structures that we would hope for. If we don't have the structures, and I'm the first to say it's not just about the structures, but also that structures are important to frame crucial conversations around both preparedness, response, recovery, etc. And I think some of the principal public-private engagements that we've seen in this area, as you say rightly, through local resilience fora, how it is that sort of local councils and others actually dock with individual businesses once something has happened. I think some of the shortcomings of our approach currently is around how we prepared for this. And I think a lot of the dialogue that we see there, Philip, has been historically around docking with understandably, the pharmaceutical industry. And obviously there's big emphasis now on the search for a vaccine, and long may that cooperation continue, and it needs to go deeper and faster. But when we think of a deeper conversation with business in the round, I think we're going to have to ask ourselves quite seriously about whether or not we've actually got the appropriate structure to do that at a strategic level. And I suppose it's quite easy to say this in hindsight in a way, but I think there needs to be a much sort of broader pan-industry approach henceforth, as we've done in areas like counterterrorism over the past decade, to actually make sure that as a society, as a country, we're able to mitigate that.
But then when you look at the scale of what's happened and the speed that's happened, I think it's fair to say from a cross-government approach and a government and cross-industry approach, the reaction has been absolutely phenomenal.
Absolutely. And, we've seen that at ADS a lot. We represent companies operating across the aerospace, defence, security and space sectors. And, were we to say just 8 weeks ago that major aerospace suppliers in this country would be sort of pivoting their manufacturing sort of supply chain to the mass rapid production of ventilators in this country, people would have been quite surprised by that notion, I suspect. And, I think that's a good example of, notwithstanding some media criticism, in some areas there has clearly been a very swift result to the rapid manufacture of some of those existing solutions, notably the models of Penlon and Smiths. And so when government makes the call, and it's urgent, I think they will find that industry will respond. Of course, in the fullness of time, the question has got to come, to what extent could we get ahead of that curve somewhat in terms of some of those early discussions, the inevitable scrabbling round when the call was made, and arguably some suboptimal coordination. And in these sort of situations, we need a rapid, sort of well-drilled machinery in a way, much like we do with the military and the arrangements around drawing military support to civil emergencies. How can we think in those terms about drawing in non-traditional sectors of the economy who might, like manufacturers in the aerospace supply chain, for example? And I think we'll be taking a lot of lessons learned, but that's not to take away from anything. Exactly as you identify, at ADS, we're very proud of the sectors we represent for how so many of them have stepped up to meet the many requirements that are being made of them by government and communities around the country.
But I think after this, when we come out, we will be going into a new normal, whatever shape that's going to be. And I think industry is going to be very focused on proper resilience planning and making sure that there's that integration, not just to protect the business environment that they're used to working in, but to give that flexibility into government to be able to pivot much more quickly and meet requirements. And there will also be, I think, and it's just my personal opinion, but I think there's going to be a greater call for identifying more key products and capabilities that we have to retain a manufacturing capability, a primary manufacturing capability in the UK, and then have surge secondary capabilities which other industries can pivot to very quickly. And PPE is the classic example.
No, I think, prior to this national emergency taking place, the government had already announced its intention to develop a defence and security industrial strategy for the United Kingdom, which we very much inputted into. A big part of that work is identifying, in inverted commas, sovereign capability. And I think most of us, and I include myself in that, entering into that discussion, we're very much thinking of the sort of military stroke security machinery type questions. The sort of areas that we think about are in the security space, cryptography or covert technologies, for example, where there may be some sort of operational requirement for the UK to keep capability on shore. Again, just 8 weeks ago, would we even think that medical
medical equipment and capability might even feature. Now, I'm not saying
your face masks, gowns, gloves, those sorts of things are now going to have to form part of what the national resilience strategy. I think we've had a big wake up call.
I think it is a wake up call on our preparedness, and I would strongly argue that it's the biggest area that we need to get around thinking from the community's perspective is establishing, as we have done in so many areas of national security and resilience, sort of streamlined, systematic and sort of effective mechanisms for harnessing those industrial capabilities through. We've got a great track record as a country of doing that in the counter-terrorist space, for instance, and increasingly in cybersecurity. And I think, people do look to us. But I think, let's see what the inevitable inquiry actually says. But I don't think anybody will dispute that the level of preparedness in certain areas was found lacking. Obviously, a huge national effort to address some of those points, and I think that's very, very positive, and we must hold true to that. But I think I think there are some lessons. The additional point I'd say on this, which I think is probably again one for the later inquiry, I guess, but it has been observed, and I think it is important to note that, of course, we entered a period of austerity. Alongside the parallel process that you mentioned of risk assessment that we made as to the likelihood and impact of, for example, a major pandemic, that puts pressure on the entire system, especially when there's a broad range of sort of more malicious and sort of overtly hostile sort of threats facing the country. And whether or not one would call it complacency or I'm not sure, but there are competing demands on the state's machinery. And in a constrained sort of fiscal environment and a period of austerity, it does mean that some of the structures for resilience planning, the case is harder to make the case for some of the investment that we now wish we had made during that period. So I'm not trying to excuse it, but I think all of us heading into how we do things in the future need to be very sort of realistic about the competing demands that are made on state resources and industry resources heading in. But clearly, an assessment of this risk and the impact it can do is obviously something that we're all going to have to think a lot more about.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We always see a huge investment in the security machinery in the immediate aftermath of a terrorist attack or a large cyber attack or something else. But then as the time goes on and on and on and there isn't another attack, there's an increasing reluctance to meet that investment that has been promised because everyone thinks it's gone back to being secure again. I wonder if we're going to see the same with resilience. I suspect, however, that the global impact of this has been such that resilience will take a much bigger priority. It's interesting in the security side. ISIS have turned around and suggested to their members that they shouldn't go anywhere near Europe because of the COVID-19 and are trying to blame it on and say that it was an act of God against us. But they're using this to increase their influence in other parts of the world. For example, in Mozambique, in Libya and elsewhere, they're growing. And therefore, we have to recognize that the threat that was there beforehand is still there and is going to come back in a different way once this has all got into the new normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to all be very alert, the standard mantra, not alarmed, but we have to be very alert to shifting character of the terrorist threat and the direct links with this current crisis. In fact, just yesterday, I noticed that the national policing lead on the PREVENT programme, so the part of obviously the UK counter-terrorist strategy that is around hopefully trying to prevent people from turning to radicalisation in the first place, violent extremists in particular, actually warned that the current situation means that there is a risk of growing levels of extremism. The concern was principally there around in the same way that we've seen patients not suffering from COVID-19 not going to hospital around serious conditions because of a whole host of factors, which I'm sure we'll learn in due course.
but other parts of the our hospitals outside the emergency room, as it were, people are not attending appointments. People are perhaps not visiting doctors when they should. The counter-terrorist machinery, and particularly the prevent policing element of that, are concerned that because businesses are now all working from home, and because sort of not just businesses but local authorities, schools, etc., they've seen a very radical and quick drop-off of referrals to them around extremism, whereas they are pretty sure that actually the current conditions at least presents the opportunity for extremists to actually tap into potential growing levels of dissatisfaction with some of the community. And so that was a bit of a warning yesterday from that community. And I think we have to be very alert, as we've seen in other areas, growing levels of fraud in certain cases, or at least a shifting threat as to how, unfortunately, some of the adversaries are actually going to obviously try and exploit the situation. So we have to take a whole system approach to that and make sure that we're not missing a trick in some of those important issues that we continue to need to address alongside this pandemic.
Oh, there will. And for those that are listening to this, I talked about the ISIS threat, but the single largest or most rapidly growing threat in the UK was from extreme right-wingism, and where you've got disaffection in local communities, and as lockdown continues further and further and further, that disaffection can be promulgated over social media channels and other encrypted channels, and it's very difficult for people to see it on the outside. But when lockdown comes away, it could burst out, so the threat could be huge, and terrorist influence is almost certainly increasing during this time. As you said, is serious and organised crime through a lot of internet-enabled scams that are going on the back of this. It's very difficult times. Very difficult times.
It's difficult. It was quite interesting to see the advisory note from the National Cyber Security Centre that they produced with the Americans, the partner agency in the United States, and they concluded that, in fact, currently there's no overall increase in cybercrime, notwithstanding this current situation, which is something I hadn't quite properly understood. Albeit they did note that obviously the risk and the threat is shifting. There is a growing number of specific sort of fraudulent activity around this virus. Fake HMRC emails saying that you've got a refund because of the situation. So it shows how some elements are sort of shifting that around, and there's an interesting debating point around to what extent there's a sort of an upper limit of cybercrime. Personally, I think we've just got to be quite realistic about the fact with not just people working at home, but albeit that's a massive shift, and the National Cyber Security Centre has produced guidance around that dynamic specifically on how individuals and businesses can protect themselves at home. But also the individual, all of us as individuals, with our young people using digital devices more so, individuals and how it is that we protect ourselves and the emphasis there as an individual. I think this is going to become much more important because in a way the vulnerability is spread around even more than it was somehow. Clearly that's a very general statement. We need to analyse and assess exactly what that means. But I think the National Cyber Security Centre and other agencies are saying that they recognise this shift. They therefore think that there is an opportunity for people to exploit individuals more. And for that reason, they want to be providing guidance more broadly and generated towards individuals and smaller companies who just haven't been working at home in this manner and quite as dramatically in the past.
Oh, we've now got huge amounts of industrial person identifiable data or intellectual property related data or other sensitive items going through home routers and home broadband, not monitored by IT departments and not necessarily meeting the corporate security levels that one would expect with that sort of level of detail. And the threats remain out there, and it's serious and organised crime, and it's also, as we heard, the Secretary of State for Defence and others say, it's from nation states as well, and people have to recognise that when they're preparing their home offices for everything. I've got more security devices around in my home office office than you'd expect, but then I work from home most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. No, absolutely. And we're, for what it's worth, as ADS, we have produced this COVID hub of support and guidance for our membership. And I think it's a good example of where we're sort of trying to integrate the security aspect into that. A lot of the guidance that we're pushing out to our members, particularly our smaller company members, because an association like ours, we've got 1,200 members, of which 97% of them are SMEs by number. So that's the community that perhaps we need to be promoting. Not perhaps, we definitely need to be promoting good cyber guidance too. So we've created a COVID hub, we call it, and in there is a signposting to some of the national cybersecurity centres, sort of guidance in this area, alongside all the other support that government is producing. Because, of course, many businesses will be much more focused on the job retention scheme, business loans, the interruption scheme, and so on.
Yeah. But certainly, I think as we start to come out of this and businesses start to restart again, those that have had to almost close down, the sort of help that you with ADS will be able to give to jumpstart them back into the new business environment is going to be critical.
Well, what we're finding is that actually there's a huge appetite to connect with fellow members already. I mean, straight off the bat, we're running a much more sort of active webinar program. We have a weekly sort of COVID-specific webinar for our members, covering everything from inviting government people from the business department to come in and actually brief on the available support to them so that they have that opportunity for Q&As all the way through to sector-specific monthly briefings now in a webinar form. Now, it's a sort of service that we normally deliver, and we've quickly sort of pivoted to that now. But what we're finding is that actually we're getting registrations are up. There seems to be an appetite for people to actually come in. We've got one next week, for example, with the Home Office to talk about their approach to policy issues around crowded places protection, around CBRN, and some of the other things that we know that, whenever this lockdown does end, and it will end, quickly we're going to be moving into that period or picking up on this great pause, as some people have explained it, on the government's legislative agenda. Mm. And one of those areas is to regulate major events and crowded places on protective security. That is an enormous and important issue for our sector. And another one is the regulation of social media companies around the use of hopefully the disruption of the use of those platforms for extremist purposes, whether that's actually putting extremist content on the platform or using the platform as a communication tool. So those two big areas of regulation are coming down the tracks very quickly, particularly that first one on the protect duty about, and therefore we're doing a briefing on that topic next week, in fact, to make sure that, we're not, in this difficult period, we continue to keep the momentum up on what it is that the suppliers community can do to configure itself to help support the UK's security objectives.
Well, I think on that point of you highlighting how ADS is making sure that you're preparing for us coming out of this and the legislative challenges that are going to be in moving through that, it's a good time for us to end this with Ingram discussion. Hugo, it's been a real pleasure talking to you yet again.
It's always great to speak. Thanks so much for inviting me back.